I'm sitting here with one of my personal heroes, Cory Doctorow. Science fiction writer, activist, journalist, blogger. What more could I say? It's great to have you here at the OII.
Thank you.
So we invited you here as part of a series about politics and the internet. And funnily enough, most of the other people we're talking to are politicians. But the reason that we asked you to come along is because in a lot of things that you write, you seem to have this really sort of strong understanding of what the internet is and could be, but also, as you're going to talk about in your talk today, how it can be broken, if you like. Could you explain, a bit more about that?
So I think that politicians commit two routine errors in the way that they think about the internet. The first is that they mistake it for something special purpose and therefore regulatable. They assume that the internet is more like, say, a car, where you can say, as a regulator, well, distracted driving causes car wrecks. We can solve that problem by prohibiting car phones in cars. And no one says, well, once you do that, you do, horrible violence to the underlying utility of the automobile, right? Because it's a special purpose thing. But really, the internet's more like a wheel. And so nobody would ever say, well, bank robbers always get away from their bank robberies on four wheels. Let's make a bank robber-proof wheel. And if we can't do that, let's take every step we can to make it as hard as possible to commit a bank robbery with a wheel. And nobody would do that because we understand that, first of all, wheels have a lot of importance to our society. And second of all, that it wouldn't work. It'd be a fool's errand. It'd be diverting resource from possibly effective solutions in the service of breaking something very important. And that's what the internet is, something very important. Everything we do today involves the internet, and everything tomorrow is going to require it. So every problem that we have is going to have the internet in the center of it. And as a consequence, you're going to get an increasing chorus of lawmakers calling for the internet to be broken in the service of solving a problem. And the most common way of breaking the internet and breaking the terminals that we connect to it is to insist that they be designed so that the right kind of people can take control of them, even if the person who's using it objects. And we don't really have a model for a computer that can run all the programs except for the one that is causing problems, that's infringing copyright or passing jihadi messages around or allowing people in self-driving cars to drag race. There's no model for the computer that does everything except that thing. And so we end up with this spyware solution where instead of a computer that does everything except for the one bad program, you have a computer that does everything and then is designed to monitor its owner or its user and to have this process that kind of swims to the fore when it detects the prohibited activity and says, I can't let you do that, Dave. And in order for that program to work, the computer has to be designed to hide it because nobody wants that program. We'll just drag it in the trash if we can find it. And that means that you have to design computers that lie to their owners. So the second fallacy that lawmakers commit is the fallacy or the mistake that if you design the facility to override a computer into it, that facility will only be used by the people it was intended for, and those people will always be the right kind of people. And we already know that's not the case, right? We already know that, for example, the lawful interception capabilities being built into network switches that allow police to execute wiretapping warrants are widely used by dictators to figure out who to arrest and torture and disappear and murder. We also know, though, from the Snowden leaks, that as soon as you give millions of people access to this advanced spy apparatus, some of them will use them to stalk women they fancy, right? They actually have their own cutesy-wootsy name for it, Lovint, right, that the NSA came up with. And that there's really no way to build a backdoor into a computer that only lets good guys in. And so we create a kind of universe of increasingly horrific vulnerabilities for those of us who are dependent on computers, which is increasingly everyone. When you consider that there have been demonstrated attacks on implanted defibrillators that allow for an adversary to remotely trigger a lethal shock, or even scarier, remotely rewrite the firmware to discover other implanted defibrillators and rewrite their firmware. So they seek out other implanted defibrillators and rewrite their defibrillators, their firmware, and then deliver lethal shocks to all of them. And that Dick Cheney actually had the wireless interface on his defibrillator deactivated. You understand that it's a really bad idea to design computers that are intended to betray their owners on the grounds that they'll never be asked to betray them except in the service of a noble cause.
So, I mean, what is the alternative? You look at any government. Quite clearly, they're faced with a technology that, like any other technologies, they want to be able to control to some degree. They are facing demands from the public, whether it be about copyright or pornography online or whatever. They feel they have to do something. So, what should they do? Should they just be more open about the fact that this is not a technology that should be controlled and controllable by the state?
Well, for starters, let me say that not having an alternative shouldn't be a dispositive argument for criticism, right? I may not know why your head hurts, but it's completely valid for me to point out that beating your head against the wall isn't helping. So step one, I don't know all the answers, but that in no way invalidates the fact that this is also not an answer. The security syllogism goes, something must be done, I have done something, something has been done. And it's worse than useless because it actually diverts resource and puts people into the fool's paradise, right? If you know your car has failing brakes, you'll drive slowly and carefully. It's still a less than ideal situation. But if you don't know your car has failing brakes, that's a lethal situation. And so we shouldn't believe that we've solved a problem when we haven't. That said, I do think that there are some solutions in the realm of things like bad speech, copyright, libel, and so on. By and large, the rules regulating speech were written to be parsed out by professionals, industrial entities with access to counsel who are conducting something that is like commerce or industry. So copyright, for example, the way copyright laws historically have gotten written is the existing practice within the entertainment industry has been codified into law with no idea that this would ever have to be interpreted by a layperson. Same goes for libel laws, which I think in general are kind of a crazy idea because mostly they just let rich people shut down poor people who criticize them. It's very rare that libel laws get used to make the Daily Mail fall silent because they've abused some poor schlub. It's far more often that it's the other way around. But even if you like libel laws, you have to admit that they were written to be parsed out by newspapermen and by the media industry and not by children using Twitter. So I'm foursquare for, say, financial regulation. Financial regulation, great. If we had financial regulation, this would be a much better country, right? But even if we had financial regulation, even if that regulation would have to have some mechanism for determining what was finance, what's in scope. It would have to have some way to say, are you a banker or aren't you a banker? Are you doing a bank's business or aren't you? So we may say, when you engage in a transaction of a value of £1 million or more, it's financial in nature, and the Exchequer needs to know about it, and you need to follow rules that are finance industry rules. Now, if we had hyperinflation that led to a sandwich costing £1 million, buying your friend lunch wouldn't make you a banker. It would just mean that the test that we had to determine whether or not you were in scope for the regulation was no longer a valid test. In just the same way, we used to have a rule, we've always had a rule, that said you couldn't duplicate a sound recording. The fact that my grandparents never violated that rule tells you nothing about whether it was applicable or right or parsable by people in the 1950s. You know, if we had a rule that said you're not allowed to carve your name on the moon with a green laser, the fact that everyone abided by it says nothing about whether or not we all agree that it's a just and proportionate rule. It's just a technical impossibility to violate it. There is no copyright rule that is, at the one hand, nuanced and complex enough that Universal can use it to license the Harry Potter characters from Warner and build Harry Potter Land at the Universal theme parks. And at the same time simple enough that a 12-year-old girl in her mom's basement in Tunbridge Wells can make a Harry Potter fan site without falling afoul of it. And if you insist on it applying to her, you will have to simplify it to the point where it's no longer applicable to them. And so the first step I would take is where you have these rules that are intended to be industrial rules, don't insist on the nonsense that we should all obey them or abide them. If we need rules for culture, for the thing that we do when we talk to each other, and we may need those rules, at least let those rules be sui generis and reflect the reality of the vernacular activity that we undertake and the broad pool of people who they must apply to. Now, there's another set of things here. There's the crime fighting thing, right? And we all agree, I think, that it'd be better not to be blown up. And we all agree that it would be better if rapists and murderers and muggers were caught and so on. there's not an enormous amount of evidence that the big data theory of surveillance is doing its job there. I mean, you could call it the larger manure pile theory of crime fighting, which is that if the pile is piled high enough, there must be a pony underneath it. You know, and if you look at the 9/11 Commission, what they concluded wasn't that spies were not gathering enough information about jihadis. It was that they had so much information they couldn't join up the dots. Making that haystack bigger as an answer to that conclusion is of no value, clearly of no value. Now, the 9/11 attackers were mostly caught through regular policing. Osama bin Laden was mostly caught through regular policing. The people who tried to blow up the World Trade Center the last time around, mostly caught through regular policing, right? The kind of policing where you identify suspects and with particularized suspicion and judicial oversight, you obtain a warrant. That warrant is cabined off to the least amount of surveillance of the least number of bystanders as is practical, and the rule of law is abided by. That, to me, seems to be, at the very least, the starting point for this. I don't know that it's the whole answer, but to return to my first point here, the fact that it's not the whole answer doesn't mean that what we're doing is not working, should be set aside.
Yeah. Last question, because I know we're going to lecture in a bit, but I mean, the other reason why the internet is so interesting, I think, from a political perspective, is because it does sort of defy state authority, state power. You know, one of the things that we look at here a little bit is the idea of internet regulation, internet governance, where you have this vast array of different actors involved in anything from, you know, setting standards all the way up to sort of US, states and the UN, you know, trying to sort of get a bit of the action. I mean, is there something sort of fundamentally different, you think, about the internet, which just challenges politics, you know, in a really new way, in a really interesting way?
Yeah, I mean, it's not stateless, clearly.
Clearly,
you know, every wire runs through someone's dirt, right? And, you know, one of the things that we've discovered with the Snowden leaks and the GCHQ wiretaps on the head ends of the fiber cables that land in the UK on their way to the continent from the American landmass is that statehood actually does matter rather a lot in some instances. But there are a couple of major differences to the internet. On a technical level, no one's ever tried to design and successfully fielded a network whose premise was that the application should be determined by the people at the edges instead of by the providers of the pipes themselves. And that has proven to be remarkably successful. And the success of that has been largely ignored by regulators. Regulators regulate as though network neutrality were an unfortunate byproduct. And we see that from top to bottom. And the other thing is that, like many technologies before it, but to a much greater extent, the internet lowers transaction costs. And so it allows people to collaborate with less overhead. And as a consequence, lawmakers are often challenged or caught on the back foot because they never expected the diffused kind of resentment about some plan of action to cohere into something very sharp and pointy. And when that happens, it is very shocking, whether it takes the form of the Occupy Gezi moment or the Hackney riots or the SOPA protests. All of those are reflective of lower transaction costs, making things more fluid. It may be, I've been wondering why we keep experiencing insane asset bubbles, you know, whether it's the London property bubble, the commodity bubble, the Bitcoin bubble. And one prerequisite, at least according to one of this year's Nobelists, for a bubble is communication. That bubbles arise when people talk to each other about, tell each other stories about how an asset is going to inflate forever. And maybe that's part of the internet too.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for doing the interview, and we look forward to hearing more of you shortly. Thank you,
Thanks,
Cory.
Becky. Cheers.